Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Enhance International's Group's fourth in a series of webinar with featured partners scmBLOX and with Chris White and the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium with Greg Schlegel. Today we'll be talking about modeling raw materials way upstream in your supply chain across sectors of EVs, electronics, and the Department of Defense. And we'll be getting into the inconvenient truth about clustering. We appreciate you taking the time today to join us in today's webinar on building your evolving resilient enterprise. And we hope that your family are healthy and safe. This is the fourth in the series of webinars. If you missed any of our webinars, they're on the EIG website and on the Consortium website and on YouTube. With that, this is again the fourth webinar on strategic modeling of rare earth minerals. We'll be having another follow-up webinar on this same topic, a little bit more complex. Looking back, we did bring up the strategic risk paradox in our first webinar, so you can get grounded if this is the first webinar. We'll be going through some of the concepts rather rapidly in this webinar that we covered in the previous three webinars. And we look forward to future webinars on this topic and are always welcome to new ideas on future webinars. Again, my name is Jim DeVries. I'll be the host of today's webinar. And with us, we have Chris White of Dallas, Texas. He's the founder of scmBLOX with over 30 years of building simulation models. And he has a few books out there, The Dynamics Progress Method, using advanced simulation to improve project planning and management. And another one on Structured for Success, what leaders need to know to build and sustain effective organizations. And next we have Greg Schlegel of Lewis, Delaware now, is founder of Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium with over 40 years of experience with his book, The Supply Chain Risk Management, an emerging discipline. And he's a former president of ASCM. With that, we're going to just move on into the deliverables today. And we're going to first kick it off with gaining insights into the critical role of how rare earth suppliers play in your industry. And then we'll get into how that affects the clustering, the inconvenient truth about clustering, and we'll get into the definition of that in a few minutes. Next, we'll get into discovering advanced techniques in strategic simulation modeling. That'll be Chris focusing on the long-term impacts, both from an operational perspective and a financial perspective. Then we'll get into what can you do now? What are those actionable strategies to gain practical advice and to enhance your company's resilience to maintain uninterrupted product delivery? So quite an interesting topic this week. And what's very interesting again is we're looking way upstream in your supply chain at that raw materials. What happens if there's a change in the raw material capabilities or availability? With that, Greg will kick us off with his overview on the consortium. Greg?
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Pleasure to be here with you today to talk about this very important topic. This is who we are and what we do at the consortium. We have three pillars. You can see them on the right. We do a lot of education around the globe. We consult around the globe. And we have several heavy-hitting software companies, software as a service, that support the heavy lifting associated with mapping and optimizing your global supply chain. On the left, we have 5 products. We consider them 5 different products and services. We have 2 certificate courses, do a lot of education. They're online LMS type courses. They're at your own pace. They end up with a certificate from the Supply Chain Risk Consortium and Educazi, which is a long-time education platform. One is basic supply chain risk and resilience. The other is geared towards services, especially public health care. We have an online readiness assessment. We actually have 2 online assessment tools that use AI and ML algorithms. One is an online readiness assessment for your supply chain. It evaluates your supply chain process maturity and inherent risk in a chart type of approach. And the other is a brand new supply chain risk and resiliency 90-day action plan tool. It evaluates through questions of discovery, your risk maturity as a company, your risk appetite, and your risk culture using AI ML algorithms. Again, we do a lot of coaching and consulting. And finally, we have a host of platform solutions that are geared around supporting your approach to supply chain risk and resilience. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Greg. scmBLOX is the tool that you're going to see later, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but as an overview, scmBLOX is a supply chain structural simulation tool that's designed to look deep into the supply chain and understand from OEM down multiple tiers down to tier N, the bottom, however deep your supply chain goes, and understand the operational impacts to you, wherever you are in the supply chain, of anything else happening anywhere else in the supply chain. So if you're using a risk management or identification tool that says, hey, there's bad weather, or these things are happening across the world, you've got all these risks with your supply chain, scmBLOX can be used to then prioritize and understand which of those risks are the worst. Which ones do we need to address first? Which ones are going to put us out of business? Which ones are not that big of a deal, and helps with that. So, but you're going to see a little bit more about that, so I'm not going to go in too much detail. So I'll turn it back over to Jim. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Pretty impressive work you've done over the last 20 years in building this out. Thank you. With that, I'll just give you a brief overview of this Enhanced International Group. We're a group of over 60 partners at this time, growing from a people, process, data, technology perspective. And we have those experts to help you grow your company. Today we're focused on supply chain risk and resiliency and linking simulation to your decisions. We're all about empowering companies to be able to be self-sufficient with the latest tools at the lowest cost and to provide you the greatest value. With that, I'm going to go straight into the agenda today. And again, our topic today is modeling raw material risk across sectors, from EVs, electronics, and the Department of Defense, and address really 2 main themes: the inconvenient truth about the clustering of suppliers, what happens when you cluster suppliers, and the impact in your ability to absorb risks out there and become resilient. And then the second is navigating supply chain with volatile geopolitical and deglobalization risks. Today's agenda, we're going to get into rare earth mineral challenges, and then we'll get into the scenarios and alternatives on how to address these challenges of the rare earth minerals. And then Chris will be getting into the structural simulation modeling. Then we'll get into a case study about rare earths and what's going on today in today's market. We have 3 examples there that Greg will cover. And then we'll get into the recommendations on how to address rare earth raw material constraints, kind of give you a little bit of a roadmap there, and then how to get started. With that, let's just talk about what are those rare earth mineral challenges out there. And the first one, of course, is supply chain vulnerability. You know, the U.S. relies heavily on foreign sources, particularly China, for rare earth minerals. We all know that China has a dominance in the rare earth production and processing. They pretty much have a corner in the market of buying it from other countries and then processing it at the lowest cost. So that makes it difficult from a U.S. perspective, because we're vulnerable to having to get that processed low cost rare earths from China. That then drives national security risks in the U.S. and especially when we're building advanced military technologies, including jet fighters, missiles, and satellites communications. So the U.S. Department of Defense is in particularly concerned about this and has launched many programs around this, and the U.S. government has too, and building chip factories in the U.S. and starting to mine in the U.S. From an economic competitiveness perspective, of course, the high-tech companies are now reliant on those low-cost solutions from overseas. They have scale. That's an economic competitiveness issue for the U.S. And then you have environmental and regulatory challenges. And if you want to build this, we want to save the planet, but at the same time, we need these minerals. How do you create that balance? And then there's market manipulation and price volatility issues. So with this, I'll turn it over to Greg and ask him, maybe you want to comment on any of these before we move on to the next slide, Greg?
I think that there's enough concerns out there and challenges to keep us all busy for a good long time, folks. So we could talk we could talk for hours about each one, Jim. So all good there. That's enough to get the dialogue started, I would say.
So go ahead.
You bet. What we thought we'd do is do a little bit of deeper dive. Jim profiled the concerns about rare earth minerals from a ChatGPT perspective. We think that's spot on. This profile is why there's a concern. So we wanted to dig down a little bit more and give you some salient statistics. This comes from Statista via UNCDA, which is the United Nations Trade and Development Group, and OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So here's what we see. China leads the critical minerals production process. This is as of 2023. The legend is color-coded up on the top by country. As you can see, China is in the red. On the left, on the y-axis, is percent of coverage in terms of process coverage. And then on the x-axis on the bottom are some of the rare earth minerals around. And I thought I'd dig a little deeper for you. For instance, if you take nickel, lithium, and cobalt, those are very, very important raw materials to who? The Department of Energy in the United States. Let's take a look at rare earth column there. And what is in that column? Well, there's one, gallium, which is used in semiconductors. Another is germanium, which is used in infrared goggles and in FLIR on an aircraft. Titanium, which is used in aerospace manufacturing, and niobium, which is used in jet engines. You may or may not know all these on the periodic table, but they are very important, and you can see who is controlling or driving the bus at the moment in terms of process capability. So that leads us to our next section, which is scenarios and alternatives. And so with that, we'll start the discussion. We thought we'd start with an attempt to give you some grounding on the key aspects of supply chain clustering, just to get you grounded. All right, first we'll talk about what are the aspects of clustering from a supplier point of view. Efficiency gain, sure. Knowledge and innovation sharing, okay, that sounds good. Risk concentration, yes. Economic development, all good. Specialization and competitive advantage. These are aspects of clustering from a supplier point of view. However, there are concerns with supply chain clustering. Over-reliance on a single region or a supply chain for critical materials like we're talking about. The reliance can expose companies and or countries to significant risks if that cluster faces disruptions such as geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, economic instability, and more. A quick example we wanted to leave you with is Silicon Valley here in the States, in California. Well-known example of a supply chain cluster. Why? Technology, venture capitalists, research institutions, universities, highly skilled workforce, all concentrated in that one arena. We'll talk more about clustering in our case studies. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. So we just wanted to cover a little bit about the key risks associated with supplier clustering. Some are pretty intuitive here, such as concentration risk, which is an issue in a region due to if you have a natural disaster or some political instability in that region, or an economic downturn, that can, of course, disrupt the entire supply chain. The next is a lack of diversification. If one supplier fails, and it has a cascading effect, maybe with what the entire supply chain, leading to delays and increased costs. So the dependence and interdependence between suppliers can be a real roadblock and a risk here. Another one is quality and compliance issues. It's been shown that suppliers that are in close proximity often share similar production practices and standards. And while that can create efficiency, it can also heighten the risk of quality lapses and compliance violations spreading across that cluster. So if everybody's doing it, it may not be such a good thing, although most of the time you would want it to be the right thing. Increased competition. They may want some of these companies within the same cluster are fighting for it, and so they are competing against resources, and if you have an impact on those resources, that can be detrimental. Innovation stagnation. Sometimes when you're very close knit and you know everybody, you kind of move at the pace of your competition. You don't try to stretch as much. So that's what innovation stagnation is all about. So again, to mitigate these risks, companies can adopt strategies such as diversifying their supplier base, conducting regular risk assessments, and fostering strong relationships with multiple suppliers across regions and industries. So the key here is having suppliers that are not landlocked in the same region and that are competing. And that's why you see some companies actually try to diversify their own internal supply network so that they can help each other even across the globe. So those are some of the things that companies do. With that, we want to move to the polling question today and get your feedback on what are some of the types of risk events that you would like to model. We see a few of them in here: supplier disruptions, changing sources of different countries. There's a lot of insourcing, reshoring, onshoring, different types of things going on around the world, things that you might want to look at, or what would happen if you had a supplier disruption in a cluster, and how could you possibly overcome that by doing one of these things? Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, there are a lot of possible risk disruptions out there in the supply base, and some we can control and some we cannot, especially the strategic issues of changing source countries. We'll talk a little bit more about what you can do when Chris gives us some scenarios in the modeling discussion, but that pretty much covers a lot of the potential in terms of what can happen and what you might do in terms of a what if scenario.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm looking at this list and all these things. This is why we actually developed scmBLOX. It started with the military and now we're commercializing it. But these are the exact problems. These are big, strategic, long. They play out over a long term, months, if not years, perhaps even decades. And so there's nothing available to do that. So we developed a structural simulation approach that looks at these problems just like this. I'm switching suppliers or I'm moving from country to country. And if you've seen any of these previous webinars, you've seen us do some of this. And now we'll address maybe not raw materials down to the 5th tier, but you'll see it down to the 3rd tier in this model. But that's, we could still go deeper. But anyway, yeah, this is a great list. These are big issues and we need approaches for solving these, or at least analyzing them.
Thanks, Chris. And so certainly welcome you to the audience to keep on entering into this, and into the word cloud. We'll be looking at this at the end of this next section to see what new ideas you have that you would like to model. With that, we're going to have Chris take it away with the structural simulation modeling. Chris?
Sure. If you've seen some of the previous webinars, a lot of this will move through rather quickly, but this is the way we set it up. We're in this kind of nexus of, this Venn diagram, this center spot where we're taking a strategic perspective. We're appreciating this strategic risk paradox where these big issues and risks that can have a huge impact, up to 86% impact on all finances for a company. The Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium did a study for that. We only spend 6% of our time looking at those. And so we want to begin to lift our heads, look longer term. And so we're going to use simulation, specifically structural simulation, to start to look at this. And in this world, this VUCA world, all this volatility and uncertainty, it's even more important. So what I'm going to do is we'll talk about the model real fast. And again, if you've seen this before, same setup. So everything always builds off the same baseline case. Just and real quickly, what we've got, any entity in the model is built like this. If you look at the image below, receives raw materials, stores raw materials with a target inventory of 4 weeks, then produces. You got finished goods, again, a target inventory of 4 weeks, and now deliveries. And so we're looking at 100 orders a week for 2 years. And so that would mean 400 in raw material and 400 in finished goods as targets. We're only looking at one product or SKU. So if we're not saying a company's going out of business if you see something tank in the model. It just means that one product is having issues. And there's no way. So perfect yield. We're not looking at a situation where you only got 90%, good product. And so we've got basic sort of inventory control loops. As my target inventory, say raw material drops below 400, I'm making adjustments to try to get it back to 400. So this is kind of the basic model. Now the setup of the simulation, this is a lot more complicated than what we've seen before. Every blue box on here has that model behind it and is an entity that we're going to look at. You see in black on the left of the slide here, we're looking at an industry. So this is now cross industry. We talked about DOD, defense, EV, and electronics. So we're looking at 3 different industries. Then we're going to look at the impact on the OEMs, specifically one of the OEMs in the defense industry. So I've highlighted that with light blue. Then we got tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 down to critical material. And now one of the powerful things that scmBLOX can do is it can represent a company, a single company, but it can also represent a cluster of companies or a capability as well. So for instance, the raw material down at the 3rd level, tier 3 here, isn't necessarily a single raw material supplier. It's a cluster. It's that cluster that we've been talking about of raw material coming from an area with a certain capacity and capability. And so that's again, a good thing about scmBLOX is you can model at multiple levels of granularity. But we're going to focus on this OEM. So let's start looking at the actual scenarios that we're going to run. The baseline, same baseline we've always run. 100 orders a week. It's steady. We're going for 2 years, and we all share, exactly the structure you saw. We share the same tier 3 who is supplying us unobtainium, our fictitious elemental that we need. Now then scenario 1 will get a little more complicated. Now we're going to assume that the electronics industry is now going to triple their orders because they're all creating some new products. And so suddenly we have this wave of 3 times the orders coming from that industry. And of course, defense and EV are going to stay the same. And we're looking at one OEM within defense. The second scenario is after we know that there's an impact on the OEM, the one OEM that we highlighted, the light blue one, that OEM is, we're going to run a scenario where that OEM develops a new product that requires less unobtainium. So they're trying to shift from that rare earth material, and it's going to take them 10 months to do that. So they're going to suffer for 10 months. It takes them 10 months. And when they're done, they're going to release a new product that has 50% less of unobtainium and has a new supplier that's some more common material. Then scenario 3 is like scenario 2, except we're going to say, well, what if the OEM spent another 2 months? So they spent 12 months to develop something that uses 80% new materials. So only 20% unobtainium in this example. And so is it worth it to wait longer and make more of an adjustment? So that's something we'll take a look at. Now, as we start going through results, this graph that you're going to see for the baseline is the same you've seen in any of the other simulations. Again, we start from the same place where we have these baseline results, and the raw material, everything is just straight across the, we're all steady state. So all the lines are straight. So you got raw materials and finished goods sitting at 400 and deliveries sitting at 100. And so here we have it. You see those, everything's nice and steady. Now, I understand the real world's not nice and steady, but it's close enough. And the idea here is, hey, we've got a relatively steady state. If we look at we always build this table. And if we look at the results, same thing you've seen before. We pretend like you start with $100,000 in cash and you're going to make money over time. And so we get up to 120,000. So that's kind of our cumulative cash available at the end. And we look at recovery times and everything. And of course, in the steady state, there is none of that. The longest lead time is 1 week. All our orders are on time, and our minimum profit margin is 20%. So again, we're just steady state, and that's where we are. So let's take a look at scenario 1, where we're going to have 3 times the orders from the electronics industry. So I've represented with red arrows here, where now this demand is going down to that raw material, and I've got dashed lines pointing up to our OEM that says there's going to be this residual effect. So it's interesting when you get in supply chains, they're very complicated, they're very complex, there's a lot of crisscross, and something can happen on one side of the supply chain. You don't have to change anything, and you might still suffer some sort of impact, just the ripple effect through the supply chain. So let's take a look at what those results are. And what we see is that when there's this increase in orders, that eventually us as this OEM on the defense side suffer. We don't get our raw materials, which then reduces our raw material inventory. We drain our raw materials, we drain our finished goods, and we eventually get to where we can't deliver. Now, things kind of kick back in after a while, and we're back up and running. We over deliver for a while to make up for past deliveries. Raw materials kind of fluctuate back and forth a little bit, and finished goods finally, by the end, we're sort of back to normal, but it took us a while. So what's happened here is our tier 3 raw material cluster does not have infinite capacity. So it takes time to grow capacity. And when this 3 times the orders come in, then that tier 3 cluster is serving that industry more and is serving us and the electronics industry less because, again, not infinite capacity. So while that capacity is growing in that cluster region for the tier 3 material, we see these adjustments and we suffer from that, even though we changed nothing. And so this is an interesting slide. So now let's look at
Chris,
yes.
Just to take a moment of break here, in reality, during COVID, with the chips in the cars and so forth, can you relate it to this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of what we saw, and it's a combination of certain industries picking up a little bit more, but it's also a combination of just that fact that there's not infinite capacity out there. So as soon as everyone panics and orders a lot, it clears the pipelines, and it takes a while for the capacity to build up. Well, then that capacity builds up, and it's sending a lot out there. And now we don't, it's a little bit later. Now we don't need as much. So there's this oversurge. And that's why you see the raw materials grow is at that point in time, here comes this tsunami of stuff that got ordered a long time ago, and now it's coming in. And now we react and we're like, whoa, 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 stop ordering. And that's why you start to see the bullwhip effect in these oscillations. So absolutely. The chip example, that's a great example. Everyone probably remembers toilet paper, the personal protection equipment, the baby formula, all those things had that same dynamic occur.
Yeah, and the cars that were missing functions. So if you buy a 2022 car, it's going to probably have some missing functionality unless they went back and finally put that chip in.
Exactly. And in the short term, a lot of them just sat the cars out there and said, we're waiting and we don't have inventory to sell. So absolutely. So if we now look at the results, again, we're going to build this table and do a comparison. We'll see that in terms of cash, by the end, we sort of catch up. So we're a little bit lower, but this isn't about money necessarily, especially if you think of defense. It's about saving lives, from the defense angle. So what we care more about are deliveries. In this case, money's not the key indicator. It's all these others in terms of deliveries and capabilities. And if we look, we suffer a 17-week delay for us to recover back to where we're delivering at 50% of what, so out of 150 to where we're delivering at 50%. It takes us another 3 weeks, a total of 20 weeks to get to where we're at least doing what we were before. Now we actually overshoot because we're going to make up, and it's at some point in time, we're delivering up to 200 every week, but that's because we're making up. But it takes us 20 weeks just to get back to that 100. We see some spikes in raw material, and the highest is much, you saw a big spike there. It's 182% over the target value that we want. And it drops as low as 99%. So we actually never run out, but we are sliver thin to running out. Finished goods never goes above because it's always it's later and there's a delay and it's always just kind of building back up. But it suffers as well. You saw the dips in raw material and then soon after finished goods, and those go down again, not exactly running out, but coming pretty darn close. While that's happening, all these delays, our orders are just, the backlog of orders that we have to satisfy just keeps growing. And so we experience a 1,400% growth above our normal orders backlog. It creates our longest lead time of 15 weeks compared to 1 week that is our normal. We only delivered 67% on time, and our minimum profit margin plummets to negative 760% at some point during that 2-year period, just representing that we're not selling anything, and yet we've got all this, we've got this stuff coming into our supply, into our company that we're paying for. So let's go look at the next. So that's a tough scenario. We don't necessarily like that. So let's look at this situation, and this is one of the strategies for dealing with rare earth materials is, well, let's build something that doesn't actually require it. It requires something that's more common or eliminates it altogether. Anyway, we're going to assume that that we as the OEM in the defense industry are going to spend 10 months to develop a new version of this product that only requires 50% of the unobtainium from that cluster, that tier 3 cluster. So I'm representing that with a new supplier in yellow. And so in the simulation at month 11, we're going to switch, because month 1 is when the 3X order occurred, and now we're going to add 10 months. So month 11, we make the switch, and we can now get 50% from another company, or essentially 50% of the material from a different supplier, and we're not quite as reliant on the raw material. So now if we look at those results, what we see, again, you have some oscillations, but what's interesting is you'll notice deliveries are solid the whole time. We never suffer. So even though raw material drops, it doesn't drop as much. And you see finished goods only drops a little bit because raw materials didn't drop that much. And so we tended to have enough raw materials, which tended to give us, and again, based on that 4-week target inventory, we had extra raw material, so we could survive that. And our finished goods dips a little bit, but deliveries were never impacted. So if we look at, so there was some benefit in creating this new product and eliminating our reliance on this tier 3, and to us not as bad. So if we now look at this table and do another comparison, the cash available is a little better, almost like the baseline. But again, this isn't about finances. It's about looking at what happens with the operations and deliveries, because from a defense standpoint, we're trying to save lives here. The recovery, you'll notice, like the baseline, we didn't suffer. So our deliveries were always there. So we didn't suffer there. We did have a spike in raw material up as much as 160%. But our lowest was only down to minus 80%. So we didn't drop all the way down to that really, small sliver. We actually had some extra there. And you'll see with finished goods, what we saw, it never went higher, and it only went 10% lower in that one little dip. Our orders backlog, because we were delivering the whole time and satisfying, that never grew beyond what we expected or what we have in the baseline. So matching the baseline, we got a 1 week lead time, we got 100% deliveries. We did suffer a little on the profit margin, negative 36 at one point, just because of the shifting in raw materials and finished goods versus deliveries. And as those rise and lower, then our profit margin is impacted. So what we see right there was there's some benefit to spending the time to create a new product that requires less of this critical material. So in scenario 3, what we want to look at is, what if we spent a little more time and got rid of even more of that critical material? So now we're going to take 12 months, and that extra 2 months buys us 30% more. So now we get rid of 80% of unobtainium, and we only need 20%. So now if we look at our supplier map right here, we see that at month 13 in the simulation, and again, we're going 2 years, so 24. In month 13, we're now 80% is going, 80% of our orders are going to this supplier, and 20% are going to the critical raw material cluster now. So is it worth the wait? Is it worth to wait and get a little bit more? And what we see is that that extra 2 months was actually quite important to us. And we did drop. This looks closer to the first scenario where we did nothing, where because of that longer delay, we are actually impacted. We see our raw material drop, but it starts to climb. It's not as bad. We don't sit in that bathtub down low for a long time. It dips and it starts to come back up. But because it dips, our finished goods eventually dip. Our deliveries do suffer for a while, and you can see we kind of come out, and then finally we're back to our status quo. We look at the chart for that now, looking at the table, we see finances somewhere in between scenario 1 and 2. That's kind of what we're seeing. All the results are in between. So we see in scenario 3, waiting, an additional 12 months to get 80%. We see that we've dropped our 50% delivery metric to 7 weeks. We still don't like that, but compared to the scenario 1, we've dropped it. Our 100% recovery time is a little slower, and so it's still 16 weeks. That's quite a long period of time. We actually experienced a higher spike in raw material of 213% with a low of negative 98. So not quite as bad, but we're still just barely survived. We saw it get almost down to the bottom, but then start to climb. Same with finished goods. We didn't overshoot, but we went down to negative 95%, so not near as bad, or not as bad as scenario 1, but we're still down there. Our highest orders backlog spiked at 703%. Longest lead time was 8 weeks. So you can see everything kind of falling in between scenario 1 and scenario 2. And then our on-time delivery, 78%, minimum profit margin of negative 106. So very interesting that waiting that much longer, even though there was a bigger benefit, actually hurt us in this situation. Now, in the end, it might be worth it to keep doing it and get rid of 100%. We didn't consider that scenario, but you may suffer some in the short term while you build that up, and then you're protected for the longer term. But in just looking at this 2-year scenario and looking at the difference, it seems like it's better to get a product out there fast that immediately drops your reliance on the new material is one of the better solutions. So now in these slides, what we're going to do is lay all these results together. So these are the raw material graphs from all the scenarios that we saw, except all put together. So you can see that effect, which one's the worst, and kind of in between. So we got the baseline, of course, the straight line. We always stay at 400. You see that dashed red line is scenario 1. That dips and stays down for many months and then finally rises. We see scenario 2, the green line, which doesn't dip as much and does some oscillation. And then the blue line that Jim's highlighting right now, the blue dotted line, is scenario 3, kind of in between those, where we dip, but not as bad, and we begin to climb out, but it's a slow climb, and then we overshoot. So, you know, in these situations, scenario 2 had the least impact on our raw material. If we now go look at the finished goods, similar graph and similar results. We see that the baseline is straight, of course, but scenario 1, the dashed red line, is the one that suffers the most. Now, all of these by the end are back to 100, delivering, you know, on time, 100 a week, but they each suffer different amounts of time. So scenario 1 is longer. Scenario 3, where we're waiting for 80%, is in between. And then scenario 2, you see we suffer just a little bit in terms of finished goods, but not enough to impact deliveries. So now if we look at deliveries, so we're kind of building through that, so that internal process for the OEM of raw material, finished goods, and now deliveries. And you see in the deliveries, 100 baseline, but scenario 2 is also that same 100. It never suffers in terms of deliveries. Scenario 1, the dashed red line, does suffer, and scenario 3, the dotted blue line, is somewhere in between. So again, we see these staggered impacts. And what's great about this kind of structural simulation that we do with scmBLOX is that we can sit there and lay all these alternatives out together and show the impacts apples to apples, and it makes it a lot more effective for decision making to be able to say, yeah, I can see and to kind of understand the physics of this supply chain and how it's acting and where I'm getting benefits. And so it's pretty powerful. If we look at the profit margin, you see a lot of oscillations, but that's because raw materials rising and things like that. So suddenly you have a lot of material and you only have a few deliveries. You know, you're making sales, and then sometimes you don't have enough raw material and you're making deliveries, so you're actually above 20%. But your baseline, your minimum, you just stay at 20%. The red dotted dash line, of course, dips way off the chart. Same with scenario 3, where we're going to wait 12 months and do 80%. That dips, not as bad. And you can see actually with scenario 3, that dotted blue line starts to come up faster than the dashed red line. But scenario 2, you see, stays on this chart, and I've got some back and forth, and it dips to negative 36% at the worst. But again, those are periodic dips, and we see that we're still doing all right. And if we look at in the end, the financial impact overall, again, in this situation, example, it's not quite all about money. We're saving lives in the Department of Defense, but that black line is your baseline, 120K, a little over 120K. You see they end up being rank ordered there, even though, you know, slight differences, but they're still rank ordered, where scenario 2 does better, scenario 3 a little worse, and then the worst of all of them is scenario 1, where we do nothing. So it's very interesting to see all these lay out and be able to compare that apples to apples and look at our operations in this total ecosystem.
Thanks, Chris. Fascinating story, case study, bringing in a lot of different variables. It just gives you a taste of what can be done with your tool. Yeah. So thanks
Absolutely.
for sharing, doing all the hard work of putting the model together and giving us some insights to scenarios. And it's as we develop these scenarios, we really didn't know how it would turn out, right? I mean, these are not known, these are not published scenarios. You're not going to pick up a book and find these anywhere. These are very first of a kind type scenarios that you've developed. And you know, that's the beauty of this, is once the scenarios are done and you see the results, you kind of shrug your shoulders and say, gee, that makes sense. But you make it look easy, I say, when we go through these scenarios, but actually the work it takes to build it and come up with the scenarios, just like anything else when you're modeling, it's 90% sweat and planning, and 10% looking at the results and saying, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll tell you what's interesting is that those are good points. And as you're building the scenarios, having a tool where, you know, all right, I can get some answers, but it forces you to begin to ask the questions better of what am I really trying to understand, and what do I really think would happen, and how would I react to that? Where if you don't have the pressure of having to actually be explicit, those kinds of things are easy to shrug off and kind of, we do something about it. Well, what would you do about it, and how, and would that be effective? And so it's a great way of kind of looking at that.
Yeah, all too often we say it will never happen. When you're sitting at the executive board or you're sitting in your regional meetings and you just recovered after an event, you say, well, that will never happen again. But it could happen again. You could have another tsunami. You could have another flood. You know, it may manifest its way differently,
Yeah.
but it, you know, on how it affects your swings, you may have a competitor blindside you
Well,
by pulling out things.
you think in the real world, that scenario one where the OEM everything tanked, that CEO would have been fired, right? In the
Yeah,
real world, it's like, oh, that's doing terrible. Well, you know, the OEM didn't change anything. That was all something happening elsewhere in the supply chain that now we're affected by. So it had nothing to do with how they were managing their company at the time. So anyway, it's interesting when you say blindsided. You know, the board would have come in and kicked the CEO out right
yeah,
there, and that would he or she would have been blindsided. But anyway.
absolutely. So somebody added natural disasters, absolutely, especially when you're in a clustered area. The
Hmm.
natural disasters are things that you really need to plan around. And that's the whole idea. It's like, well, what happens if we have all our production in Malaysia and Penang and the tsunami hits, and
Yeah.
wipes out everything for, we don't know. We don't know. So we're just trying to help folks become aware, and you can plan for these things. You can build
Yeah.
these contingency plans. You don't have to wait until it happens.
Exactly. And scmBLOX is actually agnostic to whether the disruption is the company ran out of money, there was a natural disaster. It doesn't really matter. You're just representing it as less production capacity and what's the impact.
Excellent. So keep the questions coming. Appreciate it. And with that, we'll move on to the case study with Greg.
You bet. Thanks, Jim. Great, great discussion. I think I'll add my 2 cents. What you see in the model, it does get complicated, but remember, the model can demonstrate the bullwhip effect, supply chain latency. Modeling gives you an approach to make informed decisions and strategies to thrive over time. So that the modeling approach answers a lot of questions of discovery to make informed decisions. So with that, we have 3 case studies we just want to highlight and take a quick deep dive on one. Everyone probably is aware of the Thai flood. We talked about that, clustering suppliers in a 100-year flood plain that affected electronics and the automotive markets. Those markets, cameras as well, lost over $2 billion US, folks, in lost sales and cost. The second is global semiconductor shortages. That's ongoing at the moment. That's kind of the perfect storm story, revolving around what? Market conditions, geopolitical tensions, fires, explosions, all risk events, especially choke points in a complex supply chain. So there are new U.S. legislation. There's new U.S. legislation coming out of our Congress to mitigate some of those strategic risks. And then finally, we wanted to do a deep dive on drones. This is happening now. It's a story about components of all drones invented where? In the US, Japan, and Europe, with almost all the raw materials for those drones now being made in China. We have more. We call it How the US and its allies Lost the Battle for Drones. Again, as I mentioned, this is a story about components of all drones that were invented in the West, and almost all raw materials for drones are now made and processed in China. Most drone electronics are integrated on printed circuit boards, what we call PCBs, a technology developed where? In the UK and the US. And net, now China dominates brushless DC motors, the processing and manufacture of what we call NdFeB magnets, that's neodymium magnets, lithium polymers and lipo batteries and much more. So let's take a quick deep dive on drones in the bill of material. Let's take a look. On the right-hand side is a recent MIT study, essentially looking at, here's the legend down the bottom. On the left-hand side of the picture are the technology origins. Where did the technology originate? In the middle are the components within a drone. And finally, on the right-hand side, the present raw material country of origin. All right, pretty self-explanatory. So how did this happen? On the left-hand side, well, China took a proactive approach, folks, to coordinate, support, and co-invest with strategic industries to commercialize these technologies. Began back in 2000. What does this represent? Well, we think it represents a lack of strategic supply chain thinking. From a US and DOD point of view, most of our agencies, warfighting agencies, have been focusing on tactical and operational excellence. All good, a la short-term thinking. This has led to what? A recent concern, shocking, about where rare earth minerals come from, critical to the warfighting agency. So we think it's a choke point. Where do we go from here? We would say design and incentivize appropriate capital investments in the US, develop talented technology workforce like like Silicon Valley, build out an industrial infrastructure, improve your supply chain visibility, and let's get some favorable regulatory environments so we can do some maybe friend and nearshoring and onshoring of production. It's a pretty tall order, folks, but we wanted to share a real live situation with you to put a bow on our discussion. With that, I'll turn it back to Jim.
Greg, thank you. And next, we'll get into the recommendations on how to address rare earth raw materials constraints, and Chris will get us started. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things clearly represented there with case studies and all our discussion so far is, relying on one supplier or one cluster for critical materials can be disastrous. So one method for reducing that risk is by reducing your dependence on whatever that critical material happens to be. In the simulation we did, we happened to have a scenario where we came up with some other, we may not know what that material is, but what if we did the work to create a new product that doesn't require that material? So we know that's a huge risk, is to rely on that one supplier or a cluster for some critical raw materials. What we've shown is that strategic risk can be analyzed with little or no actual data. So you saw that we really didn't get real specific. We had some very generic, hey, 100 comes through, 100 orders a week, let's just keep it there. We're going to have 4 weeks of inventory. These are just rough numbers, and yet we could still see the dynamics of the system. If we changed it from 100 orders a week to 173 or 250, the relative differences would actually still be the same. So you get a lot, you get, 2/3 of your answer, 2/3 of the direction you need to go without actually getting real world data. Now, as you get real world data, that's fantastic. You can further refine your solutions and get better with them. So, but data in the structural model, by definition, data is not required to build the model. Data is then used to calibrate and kind of refine the model. So I know a lot of folks have issues with trying to collect data, and so this is data independent as far as the model. So those are, a couple of the observations so far. I've got a couple more here where let's get to that strategic risks. This again is long term. We're looking months, if not years, perhaps even decades. A lot of the stuff we did with the military was decades. So the current tools that are very short term focused are only capable of looking in this short window of days, weeks, maybe some months, but really you begin to get outside the capabilities of those tools. But with a structural simulation, you can now look long term. And in fact, structural simulation isn't great for looking at the short term. It's designed for the long term. So you can kind of use these tools in in tandem. And what's most important, as we saw with scenario one, where electronics industry tripled their orders, and here I am, this OEM in the defense industry, and I got impacted. No company is isolated when they're in that supply chain. It's a system. The whole supply chain is a system. Everyone's interconnected, and as each company adjusts and adapts, the next company adjusts and adapts, and so you're impacted eventually. And so decisions and actions that are taken by any company or industry in this case have an impact on others, even if they're separated and on the other side of that network. So it's very interesting to see those dynamics occur. And we know about them in real life, but it's great to be able to mimic them and replicate them in a structural model.
Thanks, Chris. And so when we completed the study with Chris and Greg, we all sat down and kind of said, okay, but what's the moral of the story of this? You know, the bottom line is you can get blindsided by products within your competitive portfolio or by other products that you don't even know about. So by doing these kinds of scenario analysis, you can be proactive, especially when you're reliant on rare earths upstream when there's going to be a limited supply of these. And if you don't understand who else is using or planning to use your raw materials, you may have some unpleasant surprises, and you may have to pay higher prices in order to get those materials back, because somebody's willing to pay for a higher price, and they're going to corner the market on that material. And then you need to continually look at new ways to build products while looking at the supply chain and really doing a design for your supply chain. And one other lesson we've seen is the CTO and the supply chain officers, they need to work together. Very often they're in different parts. They may not even talk to each other except for their monthly meetings, but they need to really start working together to plan for design for supply chain in these types of events. You can't just point your finger over, oh, you should have had a new product, or, oh, you should have thought about that in your supply chain. The CSCO and the CTO need to work together. And the folks that, when those are integrated, the more mature companies from a capability perspective, they're the ones that are able to prioritize materials and develop contingency plans and overcome these challenges that we're talking about. So there are some actions you can take now. You can diversify your suppliers. You can build strategic reserves, invest in recycling and reuse, promote substitution and innovation. You can strengthen supplier relationships, increase transparency and risk management, be policy advocate and industry collaboration, drive for policy advocacy to drive that, as Greg mentioned a few minutes ago, and invest in domestic production. So increase the breadth of your vertical instead of being so spread out. So we have some contrary things here in supply chain, right? We've been talking about them over the last few months here is, you know, do you go vertical in the supply chain, or do you go wide? Or do you do a combination of the two? Do you source lowest cost, but it's halfway around the world? Or do you try to near source? So all these questions that we're asking that everybody's going through, and this is one of the top issues for C-suite today that we keep seeing in McKinsey reports and Bain reports. Everybody, you know, is talking about these challenges that are out there today, and this tool is a great way to help these companies look at alternatives on how to address these potential risks proactively. With that, Chris will get us on to how to get started.
As Greg had talked about earlier, there's always the first step of understanding how your supply chain sits right now and its maturity level. And so the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium has this free supply chain readiness assessment that you can start with. And then we get into steps related to a structural simulation, mapping the end-to-end. And when we say end-to-end now, we don't mean kind of side to side, we mean top to bottom, all the tiers of the supply chain are as deep as you want to go. Map that. And a lot of people say, well, we don't have the data for that. We don't know who our suppliers are. I tell you, as a starting point, take a look at your bill of material, whatever you're building, because 90% of the supply chain mirrors the bill of material. So if you've got something that, I've got something that breaks into two smaller things, that breaks into three smaller things, then you're going to have a supply chain that has, two small, suppliers for the two smaller ones and suppliers for the three smaller ones. You will generally have that. So you can get started relatively quickly, and that'll show you how many tiers you have in your supply chain. Get started relatively quickly of that visibility, even though you may not have true visibility. Your bill of material is a good representation of your supply chain as a starting point. So now you identify your top risk, like what we did in this particular example, so that we can make these what-if scenarios. What do we care about? Disruptions? Are we looking at shipping or transport constraints? In this case, we're looking at two industries sharing critical material cluster, and one of them growing a lot faster, and what's that impact? Now you can do a next step, do that simulation model. And again, this is different. The structural modeling approach that we're using is different than the current network design and optimization, which is discrete event simulation. This is a continuous simulation technique that shows as things gradually change over time. And that's what you need for that strategic view. And now you can review all these results and essentially come up with playbooks of responses and plans. So under this situation, we figured out this is our best alternative. Under this other situation, here's our best alternative. And now you kind of got these playbooks and plans that wait, and you kind of keep watching the market or watch whatever metrics are important. And now when I see X, I know I'm supposed to, here's my plan for dealing with X. And so it becomes this way of a more active strategic planning approach.
Yepper. We thought we'd try to put a bow on this discussion for you. We'll do the byline: risk management considerations surpass cost as a key driver of network shifts. This is the byline from a recent Gartner survey that showed 73% of the companies that they surveyed have made supply chain network changes in the past 2 years. What questions did they ask? Well, they said, what are the factors driving changes to your supply chain network in the last 2 years? Let's just talk about the top three. Number one, increase resilience, redundancy as part of risk management strategy. Amen. Great. Improving agility and flexibility of your supply chain. All good. And then the third, which is one of our old favorites in supply chain, reducing operational expenses and being cost efficient. So what's the takeaway? On the right-hand side, from Gartner's point of view, the changes have been driven by chief supply chain officers with an emphasis on resiliency, agility, and flexibility, and secondarily at the moment, lower cost strategies. So pretty compelling. I think it reinforces what we've gone through in Chris's modeling scenarios. And if you really want to dig in to this topic, folks, we would recommend Peter Zihan's book. It's about 2 years old now. It's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, or Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. A good read. You can you won't be able to put it down. We highly recommend it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And with that, we'll just close it out. Hopefully you enjoyed the webinar, and we achieved the deliverables of gaining insights into the critical role and how rare earth suppliers play a role in the industry, discovering advanced techniques and strategic modeling, as Chris had done. And then we had some actual strategies, gave you lots of best practices on what you can do now. So between the modeling and the best practices, We hope that you enjoyed and got what you were looking for in this webinar. We will be doing another webinar on strategic modeling for action plans on rare earths, because we found that there's another compelling story to be told. We will have more details on that. It's quite interesting. Is how do you find that optimum for your supply chain? So with that, again, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your questions and comments throughout the webinar. With that, Greg, any closing comments?
Yeah, sure. We hope we provided you with some critical insights into why clustering of rare earth minerals is important to your company and to the nation. So we wish you all the best in this journey.
And Chris?
No, y'all covered a lot. This has been a fun walkthrough of some of the capabilities and the new opportunities that are out there for companies in terms of strategic planning and strategic risks and issues.
Thank you, Chris, for your modeling, all the hard work putting those together. I think it showed some compelling stories on things that we often wonder about, and appreciate that work. And I think it just shows that there's a lot you can do at the strategic level. And that's the whole purpose of this webinar series, is to show that we can start addressing proactively strategic risks. We don't have to wait. We can deal with them now and proactively, and we can discuss them ahead of time to help the C-suite and the board understand what those are, so that we can start looking a little bit longer term than short-term cost out.
Exactly.
So with that, I will close it out. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month. All the best.
Thanks.
Cheers.